Cone of Silence by Jim Lee. Chapter 1. The scope followed the president across the courtyard. The eye which looked through it led him slightly, as it had learned to do so many times before. Assistants and members of the president's security detail buzzed around the periphery of the man, like drones hovering protectively around their queen. But the eye paid no more attention to them than it did to the cold which bit mercilessly through the thin black suit, which was the only protection for the body which bore it here. All additional protection had to be cast aside to make the precarious journey out onto this ledge possible. Bulkier clothing would have made it impossible to embrace the cold steel of the pillar on the corner so closely. Security sweeps had been done, and all the rooms in the nearby structures which faced the courtyard had been guarded, as had the roof of each. The eye that watched the president mount the platform through the wonder of optical magnification had allies, but not an army. It had been unthinkable to attempt to overpower the guards, or indeed even to convince them that the life they protected did not warrant the loyalty they gave. Instead, this hopeless scheme had been concocted, because no one would have imagined anyone would be so suicidal as to scuttle about on the outside of this dizzying height as the icy winds sapped away the body's precious heat. With the heat was slowly passing all sensation. The fingers which grasped the rifle were already all but completely numb, sending their muted signals back to the brain which controlled them as though from a tremendous distance. The suit itself, of course, could not have been discarded, for it was the only thing which would make this shot possible. If you have never tried to make a long-distance rifle shot from a ninth-floor window ledge no more than 6 inches wide, let me tell you, it is an inherently untenable position, even under the best of circumstances. The lightweight alloy mesh support framework, concealed in the lining of the suit, however, once affixed to the titanium cable which was now anchored into the groove between two of the large paneled sections, allowed the wearer to lower themselves out at an angle, providing somewhat more elbow room. If the cable or anchor failed, death would be little more than a second away. Once the shot was taken, there would be no time to escape. Once the sniper's position was revealed, the opportunity would pass. But too much had happened, too much was at stake. Even now, spotters would be sweeping all vantage points and might at any moment discover the dark figure on its peculiar perch. On the plus side, with so much body heat having been drained away on the terrifying climb out here, any thermal imaging equipment would have far greater difficulty identifying the shooter. The president had reached the podium and stood now in a little bubble of warmth, provided by the infrared heat lamps which had been hastily erected. The chief executive was only scheduled to make a quick appearance to honor the 2 teenagers which had been shot here. Despite the importance his advisors assured him the public would place on his appearance, he was not a man given to enduring any hardship himself. He had been assured the heat lamps would not be visible to viewers at home, and the few huddled forms that had braved the weather and the intrusive screening by security personnel were unlikely to care. The clear contempt on his face for all of them suddenly evaporated, and he beamed out the maximum wattage of contrived concern he could muster as the red lamp atop the main camera signaled that he was alive. The shooter could hear little of his words. The president's media consultant hadn't bothered to set up anything much in the way of amplification here. The real audience would hear everything just fine. The television microphones were picking up perfectly. What little public address was spared for the onlookers was being snatched greedily away by the wind. Through the scope, it was a silent film. The eye watched, the finger tense against the trigger. The ears listened, waiting for a brief lull in the wind to provide the best chance for a clean and flawless shot. The wind dropped. For a single moment, the unceasing wail of the night stopped, and there was silence before a single word bolted out of the president's mouth and resonated through the courtyard and beyond, reaching the sniper 8 stories above. "Islam," he stated emphatically. The scope moved up and slightly to the left as the finger squeezed steadily. 180 grains of jacketed lead were launched toward the president, leaving the muzzle at some 2,700 feet per second. The ceramic vase atop the white faux Roman column to the left of the commander-in-chief began to explode even before the sound of the discharge had even traveled half of the distance, following behind. The plastic lilies, which had been selected for the occasion, flew in all directions as this public servant cowered behind the podium, as Secret Service agents dove in to shield him with their bodies in the event of additional shots. But there were none, as the bolt-action rifle tumbled end over end toward the ground below. It clattered loudly on the concrete at the base of the building. The scope was instantly reduced to a crushed cylinder of ruined aluminum, as the shock pulverized the lenses into glittering powder. The sound of it caused the agents in the vicinity to whirl in that direction, and the first of them spied the shooter, hanging from the metallic spiderweb, ghostly white hands fully extended outward in a gesture of surrender. At the same time, the sound caused the president, being hustled away from the platform toward a bulletproof limousine though he was, to squirt a little more urine into his presidential underwear. A great deal of radio chatter ensued, and in moments, agents were opening the window nearest to the sniper and pulled her roughly in. It occurred to her that if she had affixed the expanded anchor at the next seam, between the steel panel and the frame of the window, they would likely have disengaged it and sent her plummeting to her death before they had time to realize their error. The would-be assassin was placed in restraints and escorted by a phalanx of Secret Service agents down to the ground level and out to a waiting armored personnel carrier. None of the agents spoke to her during this transport operation. It would seem they had been given specific instructions in this regard. Nor did she see any other uniforms. There were no local police, no state troopers, no FBI, and no reporters. After a short time in the APC, the vehicle stopped, and she was escorted out into what looked like an underground parking garage. She was not manhandled, but the hands which grabbed her and moved her through the maze of dimly lit corridors brooked no hesitation. She found herself pushed into a metal chair in a bright circle of light in an otherwise dark room. Shackles were fastened around her hands and feet, and then all but 2 agents, one to either side of the door, departed. She sat. She guessed they were trying to make her sweat, that the silent treatment was merely a stalling tactic while they tried to figure out what direction to proceed in. She looked at the faces of the 2 remaining agents. She couldn't see their eyes. They all wore reflective sunglasses. Both men were smiling and appeared to be chewing gum. Good, she thought. The door opened, and the president himself entered the room. He was holding a fragment of white ceramic. The security detail which followed him remained outside the door, and he closed it, leaving only the 4 of them inside. He stood before her and held the ceramic up to her face. On its surface, a pattern of circles marched around what had, not long ago, been a line around the vase of which this had been a part. On the edge of the fragment, the last circle was cut roughly in half. At what would have been the center of that circle, the arc of a smaller concentric circle was neatly cut, marking the passage of the single rifle round, which had made a hole as smooth as if it had been cropped out with a hole punch. "Look into my eyes and tell me that you missed," he said in a low voice. Whatever terror anyone might have seen on his face earlier, he had stored it away. Now he was back in control of the situation, the assassin securely restrained before him, wholly in his power. Here, in the heart of his stronghold, with only 2 of his personally selected guards. He looked cool, confident, relaxed. Very good, she thought. I did not she answered plainly. He smiled ever so slightly. My men tell me that it was a very difficult shot, but that this, he raised the fragment briefly in reference, was very unlikely for it to be lined up the way it is. He hurled the shard at the wall, where it disintegrated with a tiny crash. He glanced at the guards, seeming to hope to find there a response. They remained placid, though when he turned back to face her, the one on the left gave a hint of a smirk. It seemed clear to her that the president still felt a bit of irritation at having been forced to show his terror at the situation previously, and now strutted like some primate trying to reassert his dominance. Her face gave no sign of this, but inside she laughed at him. What a pathetic caricature of a man. "So what, then, is your game?" he demanded, with what he surely meant as a threatening snarl. "I wanted to get your attention," she said calmly. Of course, his posturing was meaningless. All of this was, and though she was trying to stay in character, she found it increasingly difficult to do so. It's as simple as that. "Well, you have it," he said. "Though you may soon regret your choice, you have my full attention." "Excellent," she said, and fixed him with a riveting glare. "Why did you kill Antonin Scalia?" She watched his face carefully as she said this. This was, after all, the whole point of everything. She watched the muscles in that face working and admired the work that went into it for a moment. "I am alone and have signed my own death warrant by opening fire on you. Here I am surrounded on all sides by your men, and I have no illusions about the fact that I will ever see the light of day again. Surely, then, you cannot be so cowardly, so terrified of one little girl, as to be unable to admit the truth, here where no one but us will ever know of it?" She watched as his expression changed, from shock to the more familiar territory of contempt. His snarl became a sneer. "You really want to know?" he laughed, advancing on her. "Fine, I'll tell you. You've earned it for this whole stunt, though a fat lot of good it will do you. Yes, I had him killed, and I'll tell you why," he said, as he crossed his arms before him in defiance. Suddenly, from behind the president, one of the guards shouted, "All right, chums, let's do this! Leroy Jenkins!" The president whirled around to look at the man, who he had entirely left out of his plans as a meaningless pawn, just in time to receive a sharp crack across the temple from the butt of the man's drawn pistol. The leader of the free world slumped bonelessly to the floor as, judging from the sudden spreading stain in the crotch of his suit, one or more of his biological controls let go yet another time that day. "Danny, you ass!" shouted the other guard. "She didn't even get to hear his monologue. Do you have any idea how long it took to set this up?" The girl was laughing hysterically. "Come on, Gabe, just undo the restraints before they kill us right on top of him, for God's sake," she managed to blurt out between gales. "Come on, at least we got the admission," she said, as the shorter man released her from the chair. He produced a pistol and handed it to her as an alarm began to honk in the hallway outside. "Oh, that's just perfect. Danny, you absolute," Gabe said, and turned to glare reproachfully at the taller man, but he was already out the door. The sounds of Danny's triumphant battle cry echoed back down the hall toward them, punctuated by the occasional boom of his .45 caliber pistol. "Jesus, what an idiot. I'm really sorry, Ellie," he said. Ellie laughed even harder. "You're going to let him have all the fun?" She winked at him and sprang out into the corridor after Danny. Gabe stood there alone for a moment before shrugging his shoulders. Then he pitched out his own battle cry and ran after her. Ellie had been in a holding cell on the 3rd sublevel. Gabe didn't catch up to the other two until they reached the main floor, where they were slowed down by the arrival of what appeared to be the entirety of the armed forces pouring into the lobby at a glance. Even with the upgraded weapons they had picked off the increasingly well-armed agents downstairs, it had become slow going. When the tide of fresh bodies slowed for a moment, a clear path to a door leading outside became available, and the trio ran for it, only to find themselves staring down the barrels of some kind of gunship. It might have been modeled after a Black Hawk, with enough details changed or simply guessed at to satisfy anyone concerned about confidential design parameters. The helicopter's machine guns blazed, raking heavy fire across all three of them, cutting them in half. They all roared with laughter as the scene faded to black, and "Game over, load from last saved game," was stamped onto their retinas. All three of them pulled the virtual reality goggles off their heads and continued laughing. Ellie was the first to speak. "It was really good, Gabe. I thought it was amazing. I especially liked the detail work you did with his facial expressions. It was very convincing, very realistic," she said. She ran her fingers through her hair, cooling the stripe of sweat which had formed beneath the strap that held the goggles in place. Her name was Ellie Mae Keck. She was 22 years old, and the smile, which had lived under those frosty blue eyes for most of those years, twitched in amusement. She shook her head, letting her short chestnut blonde hair settle back around her face. "But it still wasn't very nice of you to spoil the ending, Danny," she chided half-heartedly. Danny Jacobs, or Daniel Jacobs III, Esquire, as he liked to introduce himself when in a particularly jaunty mood, scratched absent-mindedly at the stubble on his cheek. He did this whenever he was deep in thought, or occasionally when he was embarrassed, as he was now. "I told him I didn't like that part. It's all just made-up stuff anyway. We don't know what he'd really say. He said, trailing off. Danny was 23, and he possessed a lean, muscular build, which, in many young black men that age, would have been dedicated to athletics. But Danny had never had any interest in such things. His parents had impressed upon him the importance of education his whole life, and he was more at home in the computer lab than the gymnasium. "You what?" Gabe demanded. Gabriel Everett wasn't mad. Not really. He was also 23, and he and Danny had been friends since they were only 5. In the tiny microcosm of the cul-de-sac, nobody had bothered to mention to them that the world outside expected them to view each other through the filters of racial identity, and they had become the best of friends. More than anything, Gabe was disappointed. He always tried to impress Ellie, to get her to see him as more than just one of her geeky friends. This latest effort was partially about he and Danny trying to put together a game they could use as a launch pad to start a business, but also, in large part, an effort to show her the depth of his thinking. He wasn't a kid anymore. None of them were. But she still treated him like one. He had allowed his dark brown hair to grow long, more from neglect than rebellion, and was growing a goatee that he thought could look sophisticated. The dark hair really only served to draw a harsh contrast to his exceedingly pale skin. "What, exactly, was it that you just?" "I'm disappointed in him. This president was supposed to be our chance to put so many questions and accusations to rest, you know? I really wanted to believe in him. But he's like one of those old magic eye posters. Once you see the real picture there, there's no way to go back and unsee it. It's easy for you guys to crap on him, and I know he deserves it now, I do. But I just really needed him to be a good president, and he let me down. He let us all down. So, even though I know it's not really him, I don't want to listen to him anymore. If he was standing right here, right now, I'd do the very same thing I did in the game. I'd cold cock him with whatever I could lay my hands on just to shut him up. Every time I hear his voice now, it just makes me sick." "You'd cold cock him?" Ellie asked gently and somewhat incredulously. "And then you'd get to live out being gunned down by the Secret Service for real, you idiot," she laughed. Danny hung his head. "I suppose. Anyway, I'm sorry, Gabe. I know you put a lot of time into the scripting, and the work you did with the audio reconstruction using the sampling algorithm is really good. Too good, I guess, because it made me really feel like it was him talking. Sort of." Gabe waved his hand dismissively. "Don't worry about it. I suppose we can do it again some other time if she wants to." Ellie held up both hands in a defensive gesture. "Oh, no. That's quite enough for me, thanks. I mean, really. If I want to hear the full details of the globalist agenda, I can just stay home, Gabe. As far as the game itself, your illusion was masterful. Both of you should be really proud. It was an intense experience, but you need to either retool it immediately or delete it. Both men reacted hotly to that. Delete it? They shouted in unison. Yes, delete it. Because whether Pop is right about all the things he says or not is irrelevant. If anyone else even sees that game, the feds will descend on our little cul-de-sac like locusts before you can say threat to national security. If you're lucky, all they'll do is smash your equipment and sue the crap out of you. And if we're unlucky, Danny asked, then they'll shoot you and your families, and me and my family as co-conspirators. Perhaps the news will say it was Al-Qaeda, she replied stonily, hands on her hips. Both men, well, to her they were still boys, might always be boys, slumped visibly. Right, Gabe said softly. What did you expect I was going to say? You managed to extrapolate a completely lifelike virtual replica of the most powerful man in the free world and put incriminating words in his mouth. You could capture video from that session and drop it anonymously on the desk of any reporter in the country, and on the highest resolution settings, there's at least a 50% chance that it would go to air unquestioned. Never mind how quickly it could be spread on the internet and believed to be genuine. If even 1 thing in 10 of what Dad says is true, then they have killed men for far less, she warned. You guys might be geniuses, but sometimes I have to wonder if you have any common sense at all. The two of them shuffled their feet in embarrassment at this dressing down. She modulated her tone, making it softer with an effort. Look, the engine is amazing. Even if you just scrap that one character model, you could still use it. You'd have to replace the script anyway. Make up something. You could even do an alternate universe timeline thing, like where JFK is still alive or something. Anything which doesn't threaten any real people. The available footage for Kennedy is too low res, Gabe said glumly. You'll think of something. Given time, you'll both think of something. And the only way you'll get that time is to give that guy's replica a Viking funeral sooner rather than later. Cheer up, she said, kissing Gabe on the cheek. Other than the deadly, potentially government-toppling insanity, it was really great. The effect of the kiss on Gabe was profound. His bearing brightened immediately, and he began concentrating furiously. Maybe we could use a composite character. We can get all the source material we want of generic politicians bloviating on C-SPAN, and then select attributes from selected people and layer them onto the model. Make him into a real monster, of the Mary Shelley variety, with bits and pieces from people both living and dead. How would we integrate the audio samples from so many varied sources? Danny posed. And soon the two of them were off to the nerd races, discussing modified algorithms. Ellie understood more of their language than many a non-computer geek might, having picked up a fair bit over the years through casual contact. But when the two of them were together in the zone, they left this world behind and entered one all their own. Look, it's late, you guys. I've got to get home, she said, and was pleased to find herself dismissed absent-mindedly. She hated to use Gabe's crush against him like that. She had known for years that he harbored it, but sometimes it was just so much easier than slogging through the swamp of his self-esteem. To her, these two were the brothers she never had. It had been that way almost from the very day she and her father had moved into the cul-de-sac, some 15 years before. She had been only 7 then, and the new house had been the first real anchor point in her life she could even remember. Everything prior to that seemed a blur to her now. She let herself out, as they continued to brainstorm, and headed across the street to the house where she and her father lived alone. Her parents had moved to Ryan, Oklahoma, and had bought the little ranch, hoping to build the little nuclear family, the American dream. The following spring, as the little tribe began to prepare for what they expected to be her baby brother, all had seemed at rest. If she could freeze those days and live there forever, she would do so in a heartbeat. But of course, time waits for no one. Her brother had apparently been adamant about not wanting to come into the world, and had been willing to take her mother out to ensure that he would not have to be born. Something in her mother had ruptured. Her father would never talk of it afterward. Mother and child both left the circles of the world silently. Her father had woken up, thinking she had perhaps peed in the bed. Such could happen with pregnant women, he had heard. That was, of course, until the smell struck him. Ellie's mother had bled out in the night without making a sound, and her father had awakened to find himself soaked in that blood. Ellie herself had been awakened to the news by the sound of his hoarse screams. From time to time, for years afterward, they would play out that same scene again, and she would find him again as she had that day so long ago, standing beside the bed in only his underwear, with the sheets dragged off onto the floor around him, howling in anguish with blank, staring eyes. She opened the gate in the little picket fence that had so enchanted her mother when they had come to look at the place. It creaked painfully, begging to be oiled. She walked past the little garden outside the kitchen window, the fallow little dirt patch her mother and father had turned under, expecting to plant seeds for a little vegetable garden. You would expect weeds to have taken root in the little spot, like they did everywhere in Oklahoma that wasn't policed against them vigilantly. But nothing grew there. It was as if the earth itself mourned her mother's passing, and this was the memorial plot. She went inside and hung her key by the loop on the peg next to the door. Her father had been on track for a promising career as a private investigator. Originally, he had been drawn to law enforcement. He had wanted to be a detective. As a boy, he had consumed the tales of Arthur Conan Doyle with a passion, not just reading them, but internalizing them. He saw a world full of mysteries and wrongs going unsolved, and he purposed to unravel them all. And he would likely have continued with law enforcement, but for something that happened. He didn't wish to speak of that either, when Ellie would ask. He had become a man of closed books and torn-out pages. He would only say that there had been corruption, and had decided it was more noble to wage the war on crime on his own, even if the only crimes entrusted to him were missing assets and dallying husbands. After Elizabeth had died, though, all of that simply dried up and blew away, like so much Oklahoma topsoil, like the life-giving topsoil in her tiny garden. After his wife's untimely passing, Gerald had, at first, applied his investigative powers to the mystery of her death. Ultimately, though, he had to come to terms with the fact that he simply wasn't a man of medicine. The longer he studied the matter, the more he became convinced that not only did doctors and nurses to whom he spoke not know how to explain what had happened to Elizabeth, they were not even interested in finding out. Their focus seemed fixed almost exclusively upon avoiding blame for that shortfall of knowledge. In the beginning, he supposed, this might have been warranted. He had been in pain and wanted, even demanded, answers. But as time passed, and his anger transformed by degrees to despair, he was very careful to refrain from assigning blame. The people to whom he spoke, however, had invariably been warned of his inquiries. Whatever circles these practitioners traveled in, it was clear that they communicated. Soon, medical personnel would not take his calls, would not agree to speak to him. Ellie believed it was this, more than anything else, which had changed the way her father looked at the world. He began to see it as a conspiracy in the medical community, to keep potentially damning information a closely guarded secret, to protect themselves. He began to litter the corkboard in his little detective agency office with scraps of paper, photographs, news clippings, anything which suggested, at least in his mind, the presence of these unseen connections, this conspiracy. The disease spread to the walls around the corkboard, and eventually to the floor and ceiling as well, with bright strands of colored yarn stretched between pushpins, connecting what, to almost all other eyes, were completely unconnected things. Well-to-do housewives, suspicious of their husbands' nocturnal activities, were frightened away from Gerald's practice. And even in the larger town of Wichita Falls, over the border into Texas, word spread. One day, the reality of the lack of clientele became inescapable, and the detective agency was closed for good. The disease of paper scraps did not wither and die, though. It metastasized in the little bedroom which would have belonged to Ellie's brother had he lived. Thus, safely relocated, the growth flourished in that room, pulsing with the malignant poison which fed it. Gerald found work at a factory in Wichita Falls. He made no effort to seek position or advancement. The work he did was enough to pay the bills, to keep the lights on, and the two of them fed, but little else. He made no friends, but Ellie believed it hadn't been for the lack of others to try to connect with her father. She could remember several times when friends from his past had come by, trying to coax Gerald out of the little room where he spent most of his time now, spinning his little web of yarn. He had calmly, politely, but firmly sent them on their way. Perhaps severing social communications with other people had a measurable deleterious effect on other cognitive functions. A study of her father would surely prove enlightening on this score, Ellie thought, for soon he began to see such conspiracies everywhere. At first, she hoped that this was a sign that he was finally moving on and turning his morbid interest into something which could lift him out of his personal labyrinth. Before long, though, the truth became obvious. Freed from the enclosing walls of limitation to that one topic, Gerald's paranoia flowered like an invasive species of creeping vine. No subject was immune to his suspicions, and he became increasingly convinced that all of them were connected. Through all of this, Ellie found herself distanced from her father. While the loss of Elizabeth seemed to have broken him, it had produced the opposite effect in Ellie herself. She became tougher. While he disintegrated, she built up and reinforced her mental defenses. The initial horror of the discovery never left her entirely, partially because she could still see it in her father's eyes on many nights as he stared blankly at the television. She loved him, or at least she knew that she was supposed to. What she really felt, though, began through the years of her adolescence to seem more like pity and shame. Her friends in the little isolated cul-de-sac were inherently kind, and she never feared any mockery from that quarter. Still, she hated having them come over her house. She always preferred to visit them instead, because whenever they would visit, they seemed incapable of letting things be. They always wanted to make conversation, and perhaps because they were connected to his daughter, connected in a way that he himself increasingly was not, he always engaged them and brought every conversation unerringly into his own poorly lit internal landscape. The real problem with that was, although Ellie herself didn't believe any of his notions, Gerald was not a stupid man. His heart may have withered away beneath the despair, but his mind was still a powerful engine of deduction, if perhaps slightly miscalibrated. Any time he would wax eloquent concerning his latest theory, the boys would listen eagerly. They were intelligent in their own right, each of them, and had access to the internet and families who loved them. Yet she could sit and actually watch the poison take hold as her father spoke. She had tried for a while to take contrary positions and convince them what he would say wasn't true, but she actually found that this accelerated the process by which they were convinced. It seemed to her that intelligent minds, gifted with a fertile imagination, long for conspiracies to believe in. Especially here, in the barren wasteland of Oklahoma, agile minds fairly leaped toward anything exciting or unexplained. In comparison to the dusty drudgery of banal reality, such shiny baubles were a breath of fresh and fragrant air. Every challenged idea was immediately parried with some obscure detail or story or reference to a larger spiral which could only be said to bear on the subject at hand when viewed through the distorted lens of belief. Her father had mastered this art, to the point that an otherwise reasonable encyclopedia salesman was led nodding with wonder into the land where moon landings were filmed on a massive studio set. Only shocking him with the admission that they couldn't afford encyclopedias had been sufficient to shake him free of the web and send him scurrying into the night at an insanely late hour. Around her 18th birthday, she stopped trying altogether. She simply let them have their story time. It seemed to work. The foreign cells of news clippings, which had penetrated the walls between the homes and begun to collect alarmingly on the boys' bedroom walls, began to wither and be replaced by art, posters from video games and movies, and occasionally girls. This latter was reserved and tasteful. Both of them hosted their little get-togethers often. Only Gabe had been nervous and apologetic about his little pin-up girl, and by the next time she had visited, it had been gone. Satisfied that they had formed antibodies against the affliction, she had let the matter alone. Her father had given her a run-down old car for her 18th birthday, and after graduation she had gotten her first job. It was only clerical work in the offices of a research laboratory, but she was at least close to science being done, and that was better than nothing. She had graduated with high honors from high school, and could have easily been accepted into any one of many fine colleges with advanced science or engineering programs. But there simply was no money for such things in the Keck household. There had been some scholarships explored, but in the end there had only been words like partial and mostly. Full remained elusive. And of course there was the fact that, in her secret heart, she feared what might happen to her father if she left completely. She told no one this, of course, and simply worked diligently, squirreling away her earnings against the day when she would somehow leave Oklahoma behind. Her plan in this regard was unclear, but it was what propelled her all the same. That was until she came home from work one evening, late last year, to find the boys in her kitchen, huddled together with her father. All three of them were poring over a scattered collection of papers, and they looked up at her arrival with a single unified, awkward glance, one that made it clear that they had lost track of time and had not expected to still be here when Ellie came home. She had been relentless after that, badgering each one of them in turn, but none of them were willing to discuss the subject matter with her until tonight. She had been told all would finally be revealed when she had been handed the virtual reality goggles. The boys were both tremendously gifted, though you might not be able to ascertain that from their high school transcripts. In a tiny town where every pickup in the community could be found slewed into a parking space outside the high school football field on a Friday night, two boys who preferred to spend most of their time playing video games were not incredibly popular. And though they were bright, they only engaged at school to the minimum required to prevent them from being held back. They had the capacity. They were replete with capacity. But the teachers the insignificant speck of Ryan could afford simply didn't know how to harness it. After graduation, both boys had pinned their hopes on some form of gaming collaboration, and they clearly had the talent to pull it off. That was, if they could stay out of jail long enough to bring such a thing to market. She felt now more like their mother than their sister. A mother of three, with two healthy boys and one malformed, sickly one, and she was terrified that despite all her worrying over it, the disease was spreading.